Good morning, number 7. Our next speaker is Troy Cochrane, a PhD student, a father and a partner, and the title of his presentation is Accounting for Power, the Actors, Networks, and Theories of Capital. Correct?
Okay, thank you.
Good luck.
We will get right to it with a graph that I'm sure many of you are getting sick of seeing. This graph directly informs the work that I'm doing. It charts the differential accumulation of De Beers charts the accumulation of De Beers relative to 3 benchmarks: the S&P 500, the Bankers Index of London Stock Exchange traded firms, and an index of South African mines. And the purpose of this chart is to show that from the early 20th century until the early 1940s, De Beers had a long-term decline. In the 1940s, its fortunes reversed, specifically in 1940, and it enjoyed a period of long-term differential gain. The question for me is, how did it actually achieve this? What were the qualities that resulted in these quantities of accumulation? And I think for those of us who accept the work of Nitzan and Bichler, we know that it's not simply economic. We know that it's not simply political. So is it social? And I think we kind of take for granted that it is social. I think that the idea of something being social is one of those things that those of us in the social sciences do take for granted. And Nitzan and Bichler specifically say that they offer a social theory of capitalization. So I think that raises the question of, what do we mean by the social? The social is often counterposed against the natural. We create this division where we have nature on the one side and society on the other, and then these two have some sort of relationship. Latour argues that this is actually one of the features of modernity, that we, us moderns, now understand this distinction between society and nature. He argues the other feature of modernity is a process that he calls hybridization, which is actually a mixing of these two, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. And I think that the society-nature divide is an untenable bifurcation in the same way that the two bifurcations that Nitzan and Bichler identify between economics and politics and real and nominal are untenable. And in fact, I think those two bifurcations have a relationship to this bifurcation between the natural and the social. And in fact, Nitzan and Bichler even identify this problematic bifurcation in their criticism of a certain Marxist understanding of production as being a transformation of nature. And they say all of these processes are really irreducibly social at the same time. However, they still retain this distinction. For example, describing the nomos, which is roughly a Greek word for the social, as being embedded in the physis, roughly a Greek word for the natural, which still retains them as two distinct entities having some relationship between them, which is problematic in the same way that the standard approach to political economy, saying, well, we're trying to understand the relationships between the two, presupposes that they are distinct. At the same time, their own analysis undermines this attempted distinction. For example, they note that the automobile industry depends irreducibly on physics, metallurgy, infrastructure, demographics, raw materials, which, even if we retain this distinction, is still a mixture of kind of that which concerns itself with the natural and that which concerns itself with the social. Latour argues that there are two standard conceptions of what the social is. The first conceives of it as a sort of stuff. We have social force. This is force made out of the social. Or it is a domain. It's a realm in which certain types of actions emerge. And we'll often see it with a list of other domains, all of which are problematic: economic, political, cultural, social. The other conception is that the social is about associating things. It's about making, maintaining, and transforming associations of all sorts. Associating entities necessarily within our societies link the human and the non-human into irreducible hybrids. Hybrids work to make associations durable. So if you simply have a human-to-human relation, if we want to think of that as sort of the pure social, it's not as durable as if we inscribe those relations into certain material goods that then become mixed together. Cuneiform makes certain associations more durable. A bridge makes certain associations more durable. The telephone, security systems, these are all irreducible hybrids, a mixture of what might come from nature and what might come from humans. Yet hybrids are also sources of instability and uncertainty. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was a hybrid. Is it social or is it natural? E. coli 0157H7 is an irreducible hybrid. Anonymous and the flash crash that was provoked by algorithms feeding on other algorithms are all hybrids that generate instability and uncertainty. And I think what we can say about all of these hybrids is that they are myriad, diverse, and proliferating. We're adding ever more of them into the world, both making associations more durable and provoking insecurity. And I think that hybrids work to make actors into networks and networks into actors, hence actor networks. What the hell does that mean? So let's take the question, who exactly capitalizes? We'll start with market participants, obviously. They're the ones who are calling up their brokers, telling them to buy and sell at this price, setting bounds on actions. And for the liberal perspective, we end there. They are the rational, atomistic actor, perfectly responding to the information that's out there, allowing markets to function, to balance all of these agents, these individual agents. But I think we can add a lot of other people who, even if they're not present, are still responsible for the capitalization that occurs. The accountants, the formulas, the computers and the algorithms, the corporate reports, the business schools, and textbooks. How do you distribute the act of capitalization among all of these participants? For my stuff more specifically, we can ask the question, who proposes when a proposal occurs? Of course, typically still within heteronormative relationships, it remains the man. And of course, again, the liberal ideology would be that's the end of the story. You have one person responding to their desire, engaging in this action. But I think we can understand how the couple is actually present in his actions of proposal. If there was no history between them, that proposal would not have occurred. Their parents might be in this. Maybe they've been getting the message, when are you going to get married? When are you going to get married? And finally, the action incorporates them into the proposal. The church, for some people, is part of it. De Beers is part of it. Their relentless advertising over the years, I think, has worked to normalize the engagement itself, not just the giving of diamonds as part of the engagement. And mass media has been extremely important. So when a show like Friends shows an engagement, makes it an incredibly romantic event, that comes to inform the actual engagements that occur. And typically, everything after the man will get encapsulated into this claim of society, structure. Why do men propose to women? It's social, because of society. And I think it's okay to do this as long as we recognize it as a shorthand, and we don't try to endow this claim of society and structure with causal power that erases all of these other participants. And I think this notion of hybrids works together with capital as power because durability has to be understood as allowing for greater confidence in obedience. If we want to think of a sort of purely social society, think about primate societies, where every day the social relations among the members of the group have to be continually reestablished. And the leader of the group, their confidence in their obedience is always very precarious because you can be challenged at any moment. And challenge just requires a body-to-body fight, where if the leader of the troop had a jail, it would help entrench, make more durable his confidence in the obedience of the rest of the troop. And durability obviously allows for the spreading of corporate behemoths around the world. A CEO doesn't need to know and have negotiated a contract with every single employee. They don't have to make every single sale. They're not responsible for every invention. It allows them to spread around the world. There are corners of GE's empire that GE CEO will never lay his eyes on. And perhaps most importantly, hybrids both enable creation and restrict creation. And the reason they enable creation is because they restrict creation. Ask any scientist how much creating they could do without their laboratory. Yet the laboratory itself is only going to allow for certain forms of creation. Of course, their creations can transform the laboratory, making other forms of creation possible. And often that's where those transformations will come from. You'll see the restrictions. We need to go here. We need this. And I think this relationship between the enabling and the restricting of creation has been recognized by others. Most of us probably recognize this. Men, which is incorrect, make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. It also gets voiced when we hear, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. The giants have given you one set of shoulders on which to stand that restrict your ability where you can actually see. So I've spoken now of durable creations, which should sound familiar to those of you who have read the book. These are Creorders. So let's talk about Creorders. I think Creordering proliferates hybrids. Actions associated with Creordering have provoked the creation, this mixing of new entities, whether it's surveillance or E. coli 0157H7. Creordering, I think, is not exclusive to dominant entities. And this can be a confusing part of Nitzan Bichler's defining of Creordering, where at times you can read it that this is the exclusive domain of those who are powerful, and other times you read it, that's certainly not the case. So here's just one quote. Earnings, quote, are the symbolic representation of a struggle, a conflict between dominant capital groups acting against opposition to shape and restructure the course of social reproduction at large. So on the one hand, we could see that capacity to shape and restructure as solely the capacity of the dominant capital groups. But I think what they actually intend is that the opposition also has a creative capacity. And in fact, what comes out of this struggle is not going to represent the intended outcome of either the dominant forces or those who are resisting against them, which isn't the same as saying it's a compromise, which is the sort of liberal understanding. And I think we also need to recognize that Creordering takes an incredible amount of work. Often when we talk in terms of these big structures, we miss the work that capitalists have to do to ensure the continuation of the systems of social reproduction that keep them in power. Creordering is an ongoing struggle. It's always precarious because, not least, any set of capitalists trying to impose a certain shape and structure are being met by other capitalists and resistance from below. And I think this work gets, or the consequences of ignoring this work is contained in this quote from Latour. Take some small business owner hesitatingly going after a few market shares, some conqueror trembling with fever, some poor scientist tinkering in his lab, a lowly engineer piecing together a few more or less favorable relationships of force, some stuttering and fearful politician. Turn the critics loose on them, and what do you get? Capitalism, imperialism, science, technology, domination, all equally absolute, systematic, totalitarian. And one of the consequences of that is that we actually end up making these entities more powerful than they actually are. And we miss the aporias, the gaps, the spaces where they're trying to shore up their power and where they're actually vulnerable. When you're identifying a system of imperialism, those gaps disappear. Creordering is never totalizing. So thinking about the automobile industry and the fact that it draws on chemistry, demographics, design, the fact that it draws on chemistry doesn't make the chemistry unavailable to the arms manufacturers. And both will be bidding for the scientists to do research on fuel efficiency or new technologies of air-fuel mixture to make bombs ever more efficient. Their use of demographics doesn't prevent the sociologists from also engaging with demographics. Their use of design doesn't keep it out of the hands of the arts. And I think this is important for understanding the process of what gets called co-option. Typically, we'll see something that's been co-opted as lost to us for resistance, as though if resistance just creates the perfect form of resistance, the perfect form of organization, the perfect artwork, it will be unco-optable by definition, and then the revolution will happen. And instead, we need to understand that just because something is co-opted doesn't mean it's inherently now on the side of power and domination. And Creordering is never determinant. And I'm going to take the example of the virtual worlds that we heard about the other day. Here's really as dominated a world as you could possibly imagine. These are wholly the creations of these companies, driven the result of their accumulatory drive, the result of the end user licensing agreements they put in place, the result of the programming that goes into all of this. Yet, as we heard, the users and the players of these worlds still made them into something else as well. The gold farmers, who were strictly operating outside the end user licensing agreements, were making that world into what the company had never intended it to be and didn't want it to be, that they then had to contend with. So coming back to my graph, when we think about Creordering and the work that Creordering takes and the struggle that's involved, I think that actually leads us to understand inflection points as moments worth investigating. This is a point where a struggle has been resolved temporarily in one direction or another. So the struggle of De Beers to differentially accumulate, which required a huge diverse range of qualitative actions, resulted in this gain beginning in 1940. And so 1940 becomes a point that I can investigate. Now, we need to be careful and not take 1940 as the time when everything that drove their accumulatory gain occurred. They would have put a lot of things into place that could only be realized in this gain in 1940. So getting back to the qualities of accumulation, I've talked about advertising before. I've talked about the industrial use of diamonds. I'm going to talk a bit more generally about the myth-making that was an important part of De Beers' accumulation. I'm going to talk about the 1939 World's Fair, where De Beers co-sponsored one of the most popular exhibits at the World Fair, the House of Jewels. This is a headline from the Prescott Courier, which is published in Prescott, Arizona. House of Jewels thrills visitors. And in the text we find, visitors gasp in awe when a display of cut and uncut diamonds is illuminated. The voice of an announcer tells them that the collection is worth $4 million. So in this quote, I think we can see how diamonds are a Veblen good. There's a process of pecuniary emulation in this. This giant pile, $4 million, oh my God. And you can have a tiny piece of that. There is a diamond for every single one of you. It goes on to say, visitors scarcely notice the elaborate precautions taken. They don't realize that the man in the elevated booth has a machine gun. So part of the myth of diamonds is also this need for security, this hypothesized criminal attention on the diamonds. There are people who want to take these, and we must protect them. This is part of their myth. They also note an extremely hypersensitive alarm, that if you so much as drove a nail into the outside wall of the building, the alarm would go off. That's how sensitive it is. So in my desire to understand how De Beers managed to achieve its accumulatory success, that armed guard is a part of that story. How far do I pursue that? Do I have to include the armed guard in my tale? And the armed guard is also networked. The armed guard is a node in other multiple networks that might also be implicated. So I want to say that the myth-making is not just social. The properties and the geological histories of the stones themselves is an important part of this. The design of the House of Jewels, in part, was the result of the fact that diamonds sparkle. So you can turn on this light and it will make them glow and everyone will gasp at the beauty of this. So the physical properties of the buildings emerged from this conjoining of the properties of the stones themselves and the desires of the people who are coming to see it. The drama of crime, value, and security is not simply social. You have the physical guard. You have the machine gun. And the mass media that reported on this, most Americans didn't get to go and see the House of Jewels. All they would have had were the reports on it. And that mass media is not just communication. It's the paper on which the stories get printed, delivered to people's houses. If employees of De Beers or if Ernst Oppenheimer had to go door to door telling people how wonderful diamonds are, they would never have achieved the success that they did. They depended on the mass media, including its physicality. So the final point I want to make is that really I could pursue that armed guard himself. I could go and pursue his family, how that may have factored into him coming and engaging and being part of this myth-making. And of course, just for practical reasons, I can't. So we need to establish certain boundaries on our analyses. But I think what we need to accept is that those boundaries are analytical, not ontological. They're choices we make for practical reasons, and we need to be conscious of them when we're making them. And it's at those points where I think these aggregates like imperialism or ideology can make sense. Because what you're really doing is not explaining, you're closing off a realm that you won't explain. Here there be dragons, we won't concern ourselves with the dragons. Which also means that the story can never be fully told. I can tell a story about De Beers, someone else can come and tell another story that's not in and of itself untrue and is part of how this accumulatory success occurred. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy, for a very, very stimulating presentation. I'm sure this will arouse a very heated dispute, so remember that we have a limited very limited time and try to adjust your responses and questions.
Obviously, there's overlaps with my stuff, so this is all wonderful for me. I have a question. It's a question I wrestle with this stuff too. I mean, the differential part of differential accumulation implies a specificity that one company, De Beers, is doing something against competitors and all the rest of that. But then the academic requirements of trying to assess and trying to provide all that seems to be in tension with, you know, the effort to give the story, to give the narrative, to call it Creorder seems to lose a bit of the differential, right? And so when you're studying this stuff and when you have to make those decisions and when you decide to do those things, how do we politicize the intervention, I guess is what I'm saying. When we decide this is my story I'm gonna tell and this is the academic story I'm gonna tell, but then you lose the differential part, the contestation. I mean, I've been saying this in my stuff too on this, how do you deal with it, right? Because that's, I see it there,
yeah.
And it's something I've been wrestling with as well.
I think, so everyone in the room probably knows Marx's famous thesis 11. The philosophers have only explained the world. The point is to change it. I think in trying to pursue this second point of the thesis, we actually now don't do either. We don't even really explain the world, and when we do explain it, we do it in such a way that it leaves it seemingly beyond the realm of change. And I think we need to, again, distinguish perhaps these processes and understand that our academic work is distinct from those points of intervention. And the ideal is that it would inform either our own or others' points of intervention. That's why I think this focus on the work that's required in Creordering, the fact that capitalists are working incredibly hard every day to shore up their order because it's never given, is already an important political lesson. That, for one thing, we need to work because they're constantly working. And we can't simply see that these are the historical tendencies and it's going to take us here. Instead, we need to try and locate where these actual gaps are occurring, where the precarious points are, and then those are the points of tension that can be the sites of struggle, the end result always being uncertain, I think.
Just a question about the precarious point that you analyzed in your presentation, which was really interesting, but do you have any theories of maybe why? So that was a reaction to, I guess, a kind of drop in differential accumulation. That fair is an attempt to create a myth of diamonds. Do you have any theories of why, of what was happening before that maybe turned them into this idea? We really have to make people love the ideas of diamonds through a case of them.
Yeah, a little bit. For most of history, the supply of diamonds was extremely restricted, and they were the exclusive playthings of the uber wealthy aristocrats. What ends up happening is that you have an explosion in supply right at the very moment when the aristocrats are disappearing, and the staid bourgeoisie aren't festooning themselves in the sorts of baubles that the aristocracy was playing with. So you have a problem of sinking demand and exploding supply, and you don't need recourse to the laws of supply and demand to understand what the consequences of that are going to be. And that's why you have this long-term decline where once diamonds really sold themselves, now the effort needs to be made to sell them.
Oh, excuse me. What really strikes me is that this is at the point of the beginning of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And there was a need to, because there's great property destruction during the Second World War in Europe, and there was a need for people to have a way to turn their wealth into a portable form that could be moved to America. And that's why the World's Fair was in America and the hype. And so it seems to me that there was a conscious effort on the part of some people to be able to move their wealth out of Europe, out of forms that were about to be destroyed, and into America. And to that, well, it's all hype, right? Diamonds are hype.
Right.
There's a very big supply, but through this process, they were able to move wealth from Europe to America.
Well, that process actually worked against De Beers, because for De Beers, it was, as you mentioned, it was extremely important for them to control supply. What ended up happening was when the Low Countries were occupied, you had the Belgian cutters not cutting, so these aren't flowing out onto the market, they're instead holding on to them. And so you have this burgeoning supply that's out of the control of De Beers. So it actually poses a risk to them. So they've already sold these diamonds on, and the diamonds aren't flowing forward into a consumer market. So the fact that those diamonds could suddenly flood onto the market posed a risk to the price of diamonds. And their concern was, if the price of diamonds ever craters, there's no getting it back, because you've broken the illusion that diamonds are inherently valuable. So I think part of the reason they maybe did this work was because you need to ensure the continuation of the American consumer market, so there will be a place for these diamonds to flow through, as well as what's continuing to come out of De Beers itself.
Okay, I was asking what this nature-society distinction or non-distinction. I didn't quite get your point on this, because I mean, for example, according to Castoriadis, you know, this idea of this distinction, it's a Greek discovery, and the basic idea is that we cannot identify orders in nature, like in physics it's about physical laws, but you can also kind of all kinds of patterns of behavior in biology and so on. And the idea, and the whole idea is that, you know, pre-Greek societies think of their own orders as natural ones, in the sense of that they are strictly observed, never changed, and so on. Whereas the point is that, you know, with this Greek democracy, you know, there's the discovery that you can actually change the social order. So, and within, of course, a range that is kind of, or to put it the other way around, the social order is not predetermined by the natural order, but of course the natural order forms a limited, or limits the possible social order. So you can't make a social order based on the assumption that human beings are birds, for example. Yeah? So that would make no sense. But of course, within a certain, within that limitation, the natural limitation, you of course can create all kinds of orders. And I would think that one particularity about capitalism is that it basically, by reducing it, yeah, the Creordering to that capital form, to that numeric capital form, it tries to explore, so to say, all kinds of possibilities, so to say, of reordering society within the limits. So it's kind of, it tries to push, so to say, against the natural limits. So for example, when you have this crash on the financial market, I mean, there is, you know, they want, yeah, to trade even with higher and higher and higher frequency. Yeah, so there's a kind of they move with their computers closer and closer to the stock market, just to be able to not only to do millisecond trading, but microsecond trading and so on. But the idea is, of course, to kind of to get as close, so to say, as the physical possibilities as possible. But that does not mean that you can't distinguish social order and natural order.
Are there hard limits? I have no doubt that there are.
Yeah, there's the speed of light, that's a limit.
Well, I was just reading in the New Scientist about, you know, the physicists who continue to harbor hope that a time machine is possible. You know, they believe the wormholes exist. If we can just find the sources of energy that can hold both ends of the wormhole open, we will have the time machine. At one point, you know, the oceans seemed like this limitless reserve. Let's just dump all of our sewage and garbage into it. It could absorb anything that we threw at it, and now we have giant floating garbage islands. So what I'm saying is that, so you make this distinction, and one of the reasons why I like the argument in Latour is he says this distinction it's problematic, but it's also the reason why we were able to hybridize so much. That the idea that we could distinguish between the social and the natural paradoxically allowed for all of this mixing together. And so you might have these hard boundaries, but within that, nature and society are enfolded onto one another. So this conference, you would say, well, this is a social event. But how many people flew here, which is drawing on all sorts of natural realities? So I think we're saying the same thing. So what I'm saying is that that social natural divide, it's an untenable bifurcation in the same way that the economic and the political is an untenable bifurcation when you're trying to understand how real world processes are occurring. I can't understand De Beers as solely a social entity if by that I mean human to human relations. It's this complex enfolding of the physical with the human.
Yeah, I just have a technical point because it's relevant to the differential accumulation. Bankers and SA Mines are both producers of diamonds?
No, bankers is, so I'm kind of representing the three domains where De Beers operated. So the S&P 500 at this time is almost entirely American firms. They sell there. Bankers is the London Stock Exchange.
Okay.
So that's their financial.
Okay, and SA Mines?
SA Mines is an index of firms producing in South Africa but traded on the London Stock Exchange.
Producing from mining in South Africa?
Yes, from mining. They're all South African
okay,
mines.
Because I took up the De Beers story afterwards, and of course a lot of their subsequent success was their monopoly and the relative labor costs in apartheid, which is important.
Okay, I'd be interested.
Awesome presentation, Troy. You continue to milk incredible insights from De Beers. New insights every year.
So are you telling me this is enough? No more?
I'll leave that up to you. On one of the slides, you say that Creordering is never determinant, and I absolutely agree with you, and that's trying to be one of the points in my presentation. But isn't capitalization determinant? Isn't capital's power determinant in the sense that market cap equals the power of dominant capital in the aggregate over society, and when we disaggregate, when we're saying that one firm is more powerful than another because of its market cap, isn't that being deterministic?
No, because it's an intersubjective assessment of those in power themselves. So, and I think for the capitalists, they would love if this was deterministic, but even by its own model, it can't be because you have multiple contenders, which is one of the reasons why I think capitalism has been more powerful than earlier modes of power, because the seat of power itself can shift so readily, where before you lop off the head of the king and a few lords and everything explodes into war because now there's a fight, where the demise of GE is going to cause a big kerfuffle, but capitalism will most likely survive it.
Thank you very much, Troy. The sociologist in me kind of has to warn you a bit and to critique a bit Latourian approach. My question, before commenting Latour, is what does the actor network theory adds to your analysis of power in the case of the beer and diamond industry? And my comment on Latour and on this strange concept of hybrid is that, for instance, the BP oil spill is not an hybrid. It's a totally socially, politically, economically, culturally constructed, technologically, scientifically constructed event, phenomena. Without any oil rig, there won't be any spills. The oil would be still in the earth. And same thing for the paper. Paper is entirely social. Wood is natural. So this notion of hybrid, for me, does not add anything to the analysis of power. And I would like you to tell me why it adds to the analysis of power. Thank you.
Do all trees make the same quality of paper? Does all qualities of paper lend themselves to the same sorts of tasks? So this natural component, so yes, you can have a tree that will live its life with no human intervention at all, and I think it's perfectly fair to describe that as being natural. But when you're growing a tree farm, the physical properties of those trees are of concern to you. You can't simply say, this tree farm is social, so all we need to concern ourselves with are the social properties. Those are indistinguishable. I think your example of Deepwater Horizon spill is perfect. You say if there were no oil rig out there, the oil would still be in the ground. So the fact that it was a disaster certainly required human action, but it was not solely human action. It was human action engaging with oil, pulling it up out of the ground. It wasn't human action in and of itself that's killing the sea life. It's the fact that they can't live in water polluted by oil. The rig itself required new technologies, new understandings of materials like steel that allow it to operate in this ridiculous environment. I mean, it should be mind-boggling that we're able to do that, and we're able to do that because we're constantly dialoguing with the physical world and enfolding it into our own. I don't know what it would mean to say it was a purely social event. Are human intentions implicated in it? Absolutely. Do I want humans to go to jail for it? Absolutely. But the fact that it occurred required a construction that, to call it a social construction, greatly impoverishes what brought it into fruition and will prevent us from moving forward to try and to keep it from happening again.
We can continue this discussion afterwards, but just to point out that, in my opinion, what I did not said in my comment is that by conflating subject and object in this way, Latour actually pulls out agency from power. So power is not an attribute of any group, class, entity. It's now there floating in objects, in hybrids more so. So I wanted you to specify why it is important for the analysis of capital's power.
Because I think that exactly, it's not that he removes agency, it's that he distributes it. And I think that understanding of the distributed component of power is really important. So it's not the CEO of the mining companies who went and gunned down the miners in South Africa. We don't even know for sure if the CEOs ordered that to happen. I think we can still understand that as a component of the power of the mining companies in South Africa, but we need to understand how power distributes agency across a whole number of actors. That doesn't mean, I don't think, we can implicate responsibility within the office of the CEO or within the office of particular politicians. Far from it. But it does mean that lots of other entities are involved in this, and to understand power processes, we need to stop carving out these huge realms of the imperial, of the ideological, and instead understand more specific processes that allow power to proliferate, which includes these materials as well.
Can I take a chance?
Yeah.
The opportunity to ask a question. I think the A&T's claims are far more extreme than just the abolishment of nature and society, which is only the first part of Latour's claims. The flat ontology that he tries to picture, to imagine, is far more extreme than that only. And I haven't seen actually any good A&T research, but I'm trying to understand how, I mean, it also, as far as it is so flat that it eliminates the psyche a la Castoriadis, or, I mean, he says he has plasmas. Latour suggests the notion of plasma, which is similar to Castoriadis magma, but I don't see how it really comes into life, because all he suggests is describing these flat networks as, for example, this mapping, and I don't see how you can do any simplification. How you can make any substantive claims other than just mapping and mapping and mapping, and I'm afraid that it doesn't allow any option of real change as an imaginary change. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I actually think of what I do in terms of mapping. I think if we take that metaphor maps are incredibly useful.
Of course they are.
How do you know where it is that you want to go without a map? And the usefulness of a map is a combination of the map itself and the user. And so a topological map is going to be totally useless for you if you're trying to find your friend's house. So I think trying to do social mapping better is really important. And I think the standard social science approach has been akin to trying to find your friend's house by looking at a globe, because all you have are, say, all you can see is the nation states. You can't see your friend's street name in there. This desire to make, on the one hand, substantive claims, and on the other hand, make change, I think the problem is the conflation of those two tasks, as I talked about at the beginning. I think change is absolutely, obviously, clearly important. I just think we need to be a lot clearer when we're engaged in which task. When are we trying to map the social? When are we trying to make substantive claims about it? And when are we trying to make change?
Okay, recess.